afternoon stream. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. You want to crush the notifications bell. You just want to crush that notifications bell because most of you are probably here because you got notifications. That's probably why you're here. So the more of you that get notifications, the more of you come and join these lives, the more fun we have together. So crush the notifications bell, crush the subscribe button, crush the like button. Let's do this, folks. Let's do this. The show must go on. It's a rainy afternoon in New York City. Went out of town a little bit earlier today for some work-related stuff. Back in Manhattan, gonna stream with all of you before I head home for the evening. Like I said on Monday, we are trying to do 5 for 5. We're trying to do 5 days in a row. So it looks like we're gonna do this today. And tomorrow, it looks like we'll do a late night one tomorrow, probably 10:30. And that'll be our 5 for 5. We are at 4 for 5 today. This is the 4th day in a row I have done a stream. We are trying to do 5 for 5. So let's see if we can do it, right? Let's see. I mean, right now we're on number 4, so it's close within our grasp. Victory. Victory is at hand. Fingers crossed. Tomorrow I'll be on here streaming around 10:30. And we will be victorious. So thank you all. Thank you all. Again, setting a goal and accomplishing it is a very satisfying feeling. It reminds you of the control that you have. I encourage you to do this in other aspects of your life. I do it in terms of exercising. I do it in terms of all kinds of things. And this week I am doing it in terms of live streams. So we're at 4 for 4. We're going to do 5 for 5 tomorrow, fingers crossed, right? Never say never, right? You know, there could be earthquakes or hurricanes or tornadoes, but, you know, there could be some kind of problem. But fingers crossed, we'll be doing this again tomorrow night, and we will be ready to zoom ahead. So welcome, everybody. So glad you're here. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Post this wherever videos are posted on Reddit. We really could use some support on Reddit. There's a lot of trolls who don't like us on Reddit, so the more we can get out on Reddit, the better. Post this on Facebook. Post this in your favorite Facebook group. Make this your Facebook status. Bring all your friends on board. Yeah, let's do it, folks. Let's do it. We got to find little holes. We got to find little holes, right? They've rigged the game against us, right? They have blacklisted us. They have tried to lock us out. So we have to find a little crack in their armor. Every little crack in their armor, every little hole in their system, we have to weasel right through it, right? And get to the masses, right? The internet is increasingly being tightly regulated and controlled to make sure people don't hear voices like ours. So the more that we can maneuver, right now we're on YouTube, which is a good platform to be on. It's really into censorship and such. But right now we're on YouTube. We haven't been demonetized yet. They haven't been able to do that yet. So, you know, we need to just grow this channel, grow this community. We are the center for political innovation. We are the city building tendency. We are the suit socialists. We are the constructive socialists. We are the patriotic socialists. We are the anti-imperialists. And we are city builders. We are city builders, the city building tendency. Thank you, A. Coco, for your super chat. And we keep marching ahead. And we are inspiring other great people to do great things. New channels are being created. New voices are emerging. New people are finding their political home in our optimistic, constructive, city building, socialist universe. We are building something positive and beautiful amid the wreckage of the world around us. Amid the wreckage of capitalism, we are constructing a shining city on a hill, a city building tendency, a community of solidarity to march forward and pave the way for the human race to escape the nightmare of greed, profits, and imperialism. the nightmare of injustice, of scarcity, poverty, inequality. We point the way forward. We are the city building tendency, and that is what we are, and we are going to keep doing it. And those who disapprove of what we are doing will not be able to get in our way. We are increasingly going to develop tunnel vision and focus only on the work that we are doing and not get distracted by the mudslingers and the smear artists and the vandals and the wreckers. But increasingly, we are going to develop tunnel vision. We are going to focus on the work that we are doing. We are going to keep doing that vitally important work, and we are going to build something beautiful amid the wreckage of capitalism all around us. Folks, the way we do things here, for those who are not aware, the way we do things, the way that we do things here, the way these live streams tend to work, is I give some opening remarks summarizing some information, some presentations, some comments, etc. I give my opening remarks, and then from there we do the roll call, where I call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then at the end, I answer super chat questions. The whole time, you all should keep your super chats coming. If there's something you want me to talk about, you should zoom it, boom it into my super chat, zap me a super chat, bonk, send me a super chat. And then, when the time is right, I will answer that super chat. I will answer that super chat question in the second half of the show. I'll be writing them down as they come in. So keep the super chats, comments, questions, things you want me to pontificate upon. You just keep those coming in. That's how it works. I write them down as we go. And then in the second half of the show, I answer them. And then when it comes time for the show to end, that's when we run out of super chat questions. So I just keep answering your questions until we run out of questions, and that's how we do it. So by all means, please send some super chats, and I will give you some answers. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and please tweet this out, share this with all your friends, put this in your favorite Facebook group, your favorite Reddit community. Let's spread the message. So there you go. And I guess without any further ado, I will jump into my opening remarks. Plenty of unnamed water beverage. Folks, one of the books that I have long recommended to people as probably the most, if not one of the most, but really the most educational books I've ever read on the topic of Marxism and socialism and the history of our movement is The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster was a very important revolutionary organizer in U.S. history, the leader of the Great Steel Strike of 1919, fighting for the rights of industrial workers. He was the leader of the Communist Party of the United States in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. He died in 1961. A dynamic writer, speaker, labor organizer, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, William Z. Foster. And it was in the 1950s, in the final decade of his life, that he composed this very important book called The History of the Three Internationals. And that book basically goes over the three internationals. And the reason that book, Lukács, the reason that book is so important is because it can be very difficult to get into Marxist and revolutionary readings, right? When I first opened, I mentioned that when I first tried to read the book What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin, it made absolutely no sense to me. It was like gobbledygook. You read Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. You read the various polemics. It can be very difficult to get through if you don't know the context. Often in the Marxist movement, people write in a polemical style. right? And it's still very popular. You know, the videos that I've made criticizing different voices on the internet have been very popular. You know, I mean, the book that I've written that sold the most is BreadTube Serves Imperialism. It's a polemic against BreadTube. It's me criticizing BreadTube, right? And saying, you think this, and I think this, and here's why I'm right and you're wrong. That tends to be how people learn things, right, is through the polemical tradition, right? When you debate someone else and your ideas clash with someone else, that's the way we get at truth. The problem is that polemics do not age well. They don't age very well, polemics. They really don't. If you do not know the context in which the argument is happening, if you do not know the individuals in question, if you open a polemical document 100 years later, it can be very, very hard to get through. You don't understand the context. You don't even really understand the points that are trying to be made. So it's very, very important to have an overall narrative, to have an overall understanding of our movement and where it came from and its history before you dig into the polemical documents. The classics of Marxism, right, that people talk about, The Poverty of Philosophy by Karl Marx, The Critique of the Goethe Program, the Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin, The State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. These books, they're very, very polemical books. They are arguments. They were written in a specific time and a specific place. British Labour Party, specific time, in a specific place, lost cause, to address a specific argument. And if you do not know the context, if you do not know the events, it can be very, very confusing. Very, very confusing and very difficult to get through. And so one thing that I have dedicated myself to doing is trying to give people the overall understanding with which they can approach these questions. And that's why books like William Z. Foster's History of the Three Internationals have been so important, because the History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster gives you a complete overview of the Marxist movement and what the Marxist movement believes and what debates and fights have gone on. And it's a very, very important text, because if you read that, you can then approach the more polemical texts. You can approach those polemical texts with far more understanding of the context in which these debates took place. The History of the Three Internationals is a very, very important book by William Z. Foster. It's a textbook that gives you an overview of the history of the Marxist movement from the time of Karl Marx all the way up into the time of the end of the Second World War. So I'm going to quickly on here, I'm going to tell you about the three internationals, because it's important to know this stuff. And that again, this lays the basis for understanding the debates that happen, because as much as the world changes, things often will stay the same. A lot of the same arguments that went on 100 years ago, 200 years ago, are still happening today. And if you can understand the history of our movement, if you can understand the trajectory of Marxist thought and revolutionary scientific socialism over the past 100, 200 years, you can have an understanding of how one might approach the questions that we are facing today. So I wanted to start out by talking about the first international. What was the first international? Well, the idea was that the working class of the world should unite. The 1848 Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx, ends with the very famous couplet, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains and a world to win." And that was basically, Marx was arguing that the national barriers between workers in Europe should be broken down. The German workers should unite with the French workers, and the Polish workers and the Lithuanian workers, and the Polish workers, and the Italian workers, and the British workers, workers of the world unite. And that as the working class, the proletariat, those with nothing to lose but their chains and a whole wide world to win, those who sell their labor power to capitalists, those who do not own for a living, they don't own banks, they don't own big factories, they don't own the means of production, but rather they sell themselves to those who do own the means of production. They sell themselves piecemeal, like a commodity. The proletariat that was forming labor unions and associations to fight for its rights, that the proletariat, as it organized and eventually moved to become the class that would take power, right? As workers were mobilizing to become the new ruling class, to overthrow the capitalists and seize control of the banks, factories, and industries, and organize the economy in a rational way so that growth and human progress were no longer restrained by the anarchy of production and the chaos of the market. That as the working class was organizing, there should be some kind of international organization that brought the working class together. That the various revolutionary working class organizations in different countries should be unified into an international body that would lead them in struggling for power on an international basis. And so Karl Marx created the International Working Men's Association. That's what it was called. Nowadays we would say working people, working class, workers, but they used a gender-specific term. The International Working Men's Association, or the First International, was created by Karl Marx as a group that unified various revolutionary working class movements and organizations. The First International, the International Working Men's Association. It was founded by Karl Marx. Karl Marx was living in exile in London at the time. Karl Marx was originally from Germany, but he for a while lived in France and then eventually moved to London. And from London, Karl Marx founded the International Working Men's Association, the First International. And the First International made a point of calling themselves communists as opposed to using the term socialism, because at the time, socialism was a very widespread concept that was very vaguely defined. There were all kinds of utopian socialists. Robert Owen, who was building, utopian socialist communities in Scotland and in Wales and eventually in Indiana in the United States. Henry Saint-Simon in France, Fourier, others. The word socialism was this very vague term that just meant one was critical of capitalism, critical of money coming first. It was a very vague term, socialism. Just meant any opposition to the rule of profits and capitalism. So when Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, he and his followers began calling themselves communists to distinguish their school of anti-capitalist thought from the other movements at the time. And they used the term communist to describe themselves. They were communists. Socialism was this vague, very broad movement, but the communists were the followers of Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels wrote the very important pamphlet, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, to make clear that the communists were the scientific socialists, whereas the socialists, social democrats, the utopians, the other folks around, they were not scientific. That Marxism was a scientific form of socialism. That unlike the various utopian socialists who had preceded them, Marx, Engels, and the International Working Men's Association did not believe that socialism would come about simply by people advocating it. They did not believe that socialism would come about by people just walking around and saying, hey, wouldn't it be better to have a socialist system with the means of production rationally organized? But rather the idea was that socialism would come about as a result of contradictions in society. The idea was that, capitalism had emerged from feudalism. and feudalism had emerged from slavery, and slavery had emerged from hunter-gatherer civilization. That every form of human existence, every mode of production, contains the seeds of its own destruction and gives birth potentially to a higher mode of production. So the idea was that capitalism had created a new class, the working class, and that unlike other forms of socialism that just said, hey, we're going to go around and convince everybody that socialism's better, Marx said it would be the struggle of the working class against the capitalists. It would be that contradiction between the workers and the capitalists battling each other, and the eventual struggle of the workers to rise up and seize control of the means of production, that is what would bring socialism into the world. That history is driven forward by struggle and contradiction, and that this was a scientific understanding of socialism rather than a utopian one. And that was what defined Marxism and scientific socialism and the International Working Men's Association. And the First International, the main struggle within the First International was between Karl Marx and the anarchists. There were a number of individuals in the First International, in the International Working Men's Association, who were anarchists. They rejected the need for political struggle. Right? Marx emphasized that it would be the struggle of the capitalists and the workers and the battle for power that would lay the basis for socialism. But Karl Marx saw this as a political struggle rather than simply an economic one. That the struggle of the working class was to take control of the government, that the working class would seize control of the state, that there would be a working class government that would be established, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Whereas the anarchist current rejected politics. The anarchists said it was simply an economic struggle. It was a factory struggle. The workers on strike in their factory demanding higher pay. Eventually the workers in their individual factories will seize the factories. It was simply a struggle of direct action on the job. Marx said it was a political struggle. The goal was to seize control of the government, that organizing unions was a good thing. Organizing workers to fight for their rights sure was a good thing, but the objective is to take control of the state and use the government to put the means of production under public control and reorganize the economy for public good. Is it a struggle to seize control of the state? Or is it simply an economic struggle on the job? That was the debate between Marx and the anarchists. And Bakunin and Proudhon and other various anarchists rejected the struggle for state power. They rejected politics and favored simply an economic struggle. Furthermore, the anarchists engaged in left adventurism. Some of the anarchists, like Bakunin, advocated terrorism. They argued that the way to achieve workers' revolution was to engage in very provocative and violent acts that would inspire people to revolt, and they engaged in assassinations and bombings. Marx argued that no, one should engage in the building of working-class community power, that political parties that represented the workers must be built, labor unions must be built, unemployed associations among what he called the reserve army of labor must be built, and that you must build a mass political movement, must be constructed. A mass political movement must be built in order that eventually the working class can take control of the state and seize control of society. And this is where Karl Marx's very famous point about labor unions, it's where it comes from, is that Marx argued that labor unions must go from simply being advocates of individual workers in individual workplaces to being organizing centers of the entire working class. That labor unions, they shouldn't simply represent the workers in one factory in their struggle against one employer, but labor unions should see themselves as being centers of power in a global struggle between the workers and the capitalists, right? That Labor unions should be centers of the entire working class, right? This was a difference that Marx had with the anarchists. The anarchists disagreed. They saw it as simply a struggle of the worker and the employer, simply a struggle of individual factories to be seized by individual workers, that labor unions should stay out of politics. They should not campaign for people to run for office. They should not take positions on what laws should be passed. Well, Marx disagreed with that. Marx pushed for the labor movement to get political, for workers' parties to be created, for working people to build popular power and influence legislation and eventually set the stage for themselves to come to power. One thing that Marx did is Marx mobilized working people in Britain to support the struggle against slavery in the United States. Marx said that labor in white skin cannot be free when labor in black skin is branded. And that the struggle of Abraham Lincoln against the slaveholders was a progressive struggle to defeat slavery, and that it was in the interest of all working people in Europe and in the United States to defeat the system of slavery in the U.S. South. Karl Marx talked about how the national liberation of Ireland was absolutely necessary, and that part of the way the British capitalists kept their power was by subjugating and oppressing the people of Ireland. So the fight for the Irish people's national liberation was desperately important. Marx mobilized workers to demand things like 12-hour workdays, to demand things like, for example, legislation to protect workers on the job. And Marx advocated the right of women to vote and women's liberation. Marx advocated that there be all kinds of popular reforms that would pave the way for working class power, for the mobilization of workers to eventually take control of the state and control the means of production. In 1871, the workers of Paris rose up and overthrew the government of Paris. And what was going on was that France and Prussia were at war with each other. And the French capitalist government surrendered to the Prussian invaders and collapsed. But the government and the working people of France, the working class that still had much of the revolutionary energy and identified with the French Revolution, that was organized around revolutionary working class leaders like Lassalle and Louis-Auguste Blanqui and some around Karl Marx, that they would not surrender in the face of the Prussian invaders. So rather than with the French government that collapsed, the working class rose up and seized control of the city of Paris, and they created the Paris Commune of 1871. And Marx pointed to the Paris Commune as the first example of a working class government, as what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. That was the first international, and it would use the term communist to distinguish the scientific socialist trend from other various forms of socialism. It advocated class struggle, it opposed racism, it fought for women's rights, and it eventually collapsed due to Marx's fighting with the anarchists. Bakunin, Lassalle, and others, they were unable to continue working with Marx, and eventually the First International collapsed. But in the final years of Marx's life, and especially after Marx died, those who did believe in class struggle and scientific socialism were continuing to organize, and Marx's ideas were becoming more and more popular throughout Europe. And as that was going on, you had the emergence of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. It was originally called the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany. You had the emergence of the British Labour Party, of the French Social Democratic Party, and eventually you had the emergence of what they called the Second International. And the Second International was an attempt to build a new international of working class parties that would fight for working people and eventually fight to establish working class governments throughout Europe. And the Second International emerged, and the Second International referred to themselves not as communists, but as social democrats. and as socialists, because they did not want to be confused with the ultra-lefts, with the anarchists who were using the communist label, the people throwing bombs, the people who rejected the need for political struggle. They were using the label communist. So the Second International, they would use different names. Marx rewrote. To Paris. The Second International, they said we're a social democratic party, we're a labor party, we're a socialist party, to not be confused with the ultra-lefts. The anarchists were using the label communist. And the Second International was very big. The First International was never very large. It was very small. It was Marx and some anarchists and delegates from different countries, but it was very small. Its influence was big. Many people read its publications, but it was a very small organization. But the Second International, which emerged after Karl Marx's death, very greatly proliferated. Millions of people were part of the Second International. In Austria, there were millions of people that joined the Social Democratic Party. In Germany, the German Social Democratic Party became a huge political organization with many seats in parliament, with millions of members. It was massive. It represented the labor movement and the labor unions. And in Britain, you had the Labour Party that emerged. It was the Labour Party. It was represented labor unions. It had seats in parliament. It was a massive political party. In France, you had the Social Democratic Party, a massive organization. That the Second International, which emerged after Karl Marx's death, was huge. And no European country was untouched by the Second International. It was a massive, massive movement. Probably the main theoretician for the Second International was Karl Kautsky. And Karl Kautsky was the leader of the German Social Democratic Labor Party. And he was a very effective writer and speaker. And he pushed forward the politics of social democracy and of Marxism in the Second International. But the Second International, as it emerged around 1910, 1905, it emerged to become a mass movement of millions of people, every European country, mass membership. You entered a period called the crisis of Marxism, because there was something going on that didn't make sense. Marxism was everywhere in Europe. Marxist parties were being formed. Labor unions were growing by the millions. People all over Europe were believing in socialism and Marxism. Socialism was very, very popular. Labor unions were being formed, but the revolution was not coming. It wasn't leading to a revolution. And in fact, Marx had predicted that the living standards of the workers would continue to go down as the capitalists replaced the labor, the jobs of workers with technology, as competition for workers increased, the problems of capitalism, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, the problem of overproduction. These things would lead to the inevitable impoverishment of the workers of Europe. They would get poorer and poorer and poorer until eventually they had no choice, amid mass unemployment and poverty and economic instability, to rise up and seize control of the state. But what was happening in Europe at the time was the opposite of what Karl Marx had predicted. Workers in Europe were seeing their living standards go up. Living standards in Europe were going up. And yes, Marxism and labor unions and revolutionary organizations were growing, but they weren't leading to a revolution. So what was going on? What was happening? Well, what was happening was that capitalism was moving toward its monopoly stage of imperialism. Right? And this is what Lenin understood, that capitalism was going from being a system where capitalists dominate an individual country to being a system where a few banks and corporations dominate the global economy and hold back economic development. And parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America were seized as captive markets for the imperialists to dump their excess products on, to keep from economically developing, and that as Britain was colonizing Africa, as France was colonizing Africa, as China faced the Opium Wars where the British forced free trade on China and tore the country down, as India was being colonized, as South America was being as the developing world was being kept poor and seized as captive markets, and the big banks and corporations of the West were dominating the world, this led to a new level of stability in the homeland. That this enabled the capitalists to pay some, not all, but some of the workers in the imperialist homeland. It enabled them to pay some of the workers much higher wages and to give special privileges and special treatment to some of the workers in the homeland, and to divide the workers in the imperialist homeland against each other. They divided skilled workers against unskilled workers. They divided, English-speaking workers against workers who spoke other languages. They divided white workers against workers, who were not white. Immigrants against foreign-born, and the granting of special privileges to some sections of the working class, and the development of what Vladimir Lenin called the aristocracy of labor, led to a stratification that prevented revolution. And it ultimately led to many of the parties in the Second International becoming less and less revolutionary. Right? The leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, the leaders of the Socialist Party of America, the leaders of the British Labour Party were the leaders of labor unions. And as some of these labor unions were getting higher pay for their workers, getting privileges for their workers, and getting seats in the parliament, they got less interested in revolutionary activity. And they became much more hostile to sections of the working class that weren't in their position. Rather than having solidarity with lower paid workers or immigrant workers or so-called unskilled workers, they would side with the bosses against them. And so this stratification and the development of the aristocracy of labor laid the basis for the Second International to become less and less revolutionary. As the Second International emerged and got bigger, it became dominated by the aristocracy of labor, and it became less and less revolutionary. And the culmination of this was World War I. When World War I broke out, all the Marxist parties of Europe, Germany, France, Italy, Britain, they'd all promised they would never support a capitalist war. A war for capitalist profits in which workers would kill other workers. But when World War I broke out in August of 1914, the German Social Democratic Party supported it, the British Labour Party supported it, the French Socialists supported it, the Austrians supported it. All these Marxist parties in the Second International sold out. They sold out and they supported the war, and they sent their working class brothers, the members of their unions, the working people, they sent them off to die in World War I, which was a horrendous war. I mean, if you read the details of World War I, it was a horrendous war. Many millions of people killed. It was a horrendous war. And it was really the British imperialists, the French imperialists, the German imperialists trying to carve up the world and divide up the colonized world. It was a battle between the imperialists. Well, not all of the socialists supported World War I. Right? Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, who was a revolutionary organizer, a woman, a Marxist, a speaker, a writer, a leader of a revolutionary group. Rosa Luxemburg opposed World War I, and she wrote a very famous pamphlet called the Junius Pamphlet that was distributed all over Germany, urging workers not to fight in the war. Well, they threw her in prison for that. They threw her in prison for not, for distributing those pamphlets. Eugene Debs, right? He was a socialist in the United States. He didn't support the war, and he gave a speech in Canton, Ohio against World War I, and they put him in prison. and he went to prison for giving that speech opposing the war. There were, various Marxists around the world who were part of these Marxist parties, but refused to sell out and support the war. And one of those was the Bolsheviks, which was a revolutionary organization in Russia. They didn't support the war. They opposed World War I. The Bolsheviks were a revolutionary Marxist group in Russia that opposed the war. And in Russia, World War I led to a revolutionary crisis where the Bolsheviks took power and they became the ruling party. This revolutionary Marxist group led by Lenin became the ruling party. And the Bolsheviks had opposed the war, and they'd opposed imperialism. And the Bolsheviks had argued that because of the aristocracy of labor and because of imperialism, that socialist revolutions wouldn't happen in Western Europe and in the United States. They would happen in the developing world. It would be countries in Asia and Africa and Latin America fighting for their national liberation. That's why socialism would emerge, that the emergence of the aristocracy of labor, the stratification of the working class, would lead the revolutionary energy to stop being in the West, but rather in the East. That was the understanding. And so when World War I broke out, the Second International dissolved because they couldn't be in the same group anymore. They were fighting each other in a war. And when the Bolsheviks took power, they announced they were going to start a new international, the Third International, it would be called. And it would be a revolutionary anti-imperialist international because the Second International had sold out and supported World War I. The Bolsheviks said they were going to form a Third International. And that Third International, instead of calling themselves Social Democrats or Socialists, because of the fact that they wanted to be distinguished from the Social Democratic parties that had sold out and supported the war, that they were going to call themselves communists. They were going to be the Communist International, as opposed to the Social Democrats. So the Third International emerged. The Bolsheviks called themselves the Communist International, or the Third International. And that was the emergence of the Third International. And the Third International was an attempt to build a network of revolutionary anti-imperialist parties around the world that were aligned with the Soviet Union and fought against capitalism. And all over the world, communist parties were formed, and those communist parties were opposed to imperialist wars and aligned with the Soviet Union. And they had gatherings in Moscow. They had the Communist International, had its world congresses where hundreds and thousands of workers from around the world would gather for the gatherings of the Communist International. And that was the Third International. And it was parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, that were anti-imperialist. And the Third International, it was very confusing. Many people pointed out that the Third International zigged and zagged. Right? It went one way, and then it went another way. One way they were doing this, one day they were doing this, the next day they were doing that. I have never heard of that book, Nathaniel. I have never heard of that book. I just don't know enough about it. I'll have to read it. But I apologize for not being able to give you a more thorough answer. That's just a book I've never heard of and I know nothing about. But the Third International, right? The idea of the Third International at first was that they were a party. They were for any political party in the world that accepted Lenin's 21 points could join the Third International. There were 21 points that were listed, and if you followed those 21 points, you were allowed to join the Third International. But some problems developed. Right? The Third International oriented its political parties to join united fronts, to try and unite with Social Democrats, to try and unite with anarchists, to build a united front of the working class and their respective countries, to have strikes and 8-hour workday demonstrations and fight to free political prisoners, etc. But the Social Democrats, they were still around. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, the Labor Party of Britain, the Socialist Party of America. And the Social Democrats were much bigger. They had many more members. And they were very anti-communist. And they considered the communist parties to be traitors because they were loyal to the Soviet Union, because they were anti-imperialist, they weren't loyal to the homeland or whatnot. So they went into an anti-communist frenzy. And in Germany, there were many cases where social democrats would kill communists. There would be massacres of communists where the police who shot communists down in the streets were members of the Social Democratic Party. There were, in the United States, the Socialist Party leaders that were part of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, they banned any communists from joining the AFL. The Social Democrats were saying that our main enemy is on the left, and the Social Democrats were in an anti-communist frenzy. And so, the orientation of the Communist International was, they said, instead of trying to build a united front with these Social Democrats who are trying to kill us, who hate us, we're going to build a united front from below. Instead of trying to unite with the social democratic leaders, we're going to go to the unemployed workers, to the hungry workers, to those who are desperately poor, and we're going to build new revolutionary labor unions, and we're going to build unemployment councils. We're going to build a united front from below. And that was their orientation. And they started calling the Social Democrats social fascists. And they started trying to build a united front from below. And that was their strategy. And during this period, you had the collapse of the Soviet, you had the collapse of the global economy. You had the Great Depression breaking out, and millions of workers were hungry and starving and desperate. So amid the breakdown of capitalism, the Communist International very effectively built organizations that fought for the unemployed. And, there was the Bonus Army, the famous Bonus Army that occupied Washington, D.C., where it was all these military veterans occupied the Capitol, demanding a right to their veterans' benefits, the Bonus Army. You had the huge unemployment demonstrations where unemployed workers would camp outside of government buildings and harass government officials. And that was the Communist Party that organized all these desperately poor, hungry people. In Germany, the unemployed associations that the Communist Party built, they had the bread riots, where at night they would break into, they would go to shopping areas and break open store windows and distribute the food to hungry people. And they, the Communist International became very much the movement of the hungry and the unemployed and the desperately poor, because the labor unions were dominated by the Social Democrats, who were reformist and were supporting imperialism. So they followed Lenin's advice, and they went lower and deeper to the real masses, to the desperately poor, and they fought for their rights. They organized the unorganized, those unskilled workers that had been rejected by the Social Democratic labor unions. They organized them, and they fought for veterans, they fought for the hungry, and they fought for black people, for African Americans in the United States. The Communist Party very much felt that the struggle against Jim Crow segregation was absolutely necessary. And at one point they raised the demand for an independent black republic in the U.S. South, a national territory for the descendants of slaves in the United States. And they fought for civil rights and against Jim Crow segregation. That was very much what the Communist Party did during this period. However, then you had a situation where the Nazis took power in Germany, and fascism was on the rise. And so in 1935, you had a very historic event, the last gathering of the Communist International in Moscow, the Seventh World Congress, it was called. It was called in Moscow in 1935, the Seventh World Congress. And at the Seventh World Congress, the Communist International went another way. They said it's time to have a popular front, to build a united front against fascism. Capitalism is naturally leading toward fascism. So it's going to be through defeating fascism that we will be able to lead a socialist revolution. And the communists must be at the center of a global struggle, a global united front against fascism. And so they switched their tactics. And rather than fighting the Social Democrats, they did the opposite. They joined with them against the fascists, against Hitler and against Mussolini and against the fascist threat. In the United States, that meant supporting Roosevelt and aligning with Roosevelt. In Britain, that meant aligning with the Labor Party. In Spain, communists from all over the world went to Spain to fight against the fascists. And the Communist International, while it existed, it zigged and zagged. And why was that? Trotskyites made fun of it. They had all kinds of stupid songs making fun of the Communist International for zigging and zagging. There was like, united fronts are what we love. Our line's gonna change again. From below and from above, our line's gonna change again. I knowed it, Browder. I knowed it, Browder. I knowed it, Browder. Our line's gonna change again. They were making fun of the fact that the Communist International's policies shifted. But why did they shift? They shifted because the world situation was changing. Because if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And that the Soviet Union was trying to survive amid a sea of capitalism. And so it was necessary to shift their tactics, to do the united front from below, and then to adopt the Popular Front. But as World War II was going on, I'm really glad you liked that book, Nathaniel, and I'll write that down. We are city build. As World War II was going on, right, it became clear that they did not really need the Communist International. In 1942, they dissolved the Communist International. Stalin and the Soviet Union and other communist parties around the world, they dissolved it. And when the Communist International was dissolved, Mao said it was a good thing. He said because the Chinese Communist Party had not been listening to the Communist International for years, been doing its own thing, and that the communist parties of the world had grown up and they could make their own decisions, and they had been trained effectively to use their tactics, and it wasn't necessary to have the Communist International anymore. It wasn't necessary to have one global organization directing communist parties. And there was something called the Communist Information Bureau, demonizing the unvaccinated, all right? There was something called the Communist Information Bureau that was created, which would distribute like communist writings and communist material. Afghanistan failure. And there was something called the Communist that's the communist movement. That's the history of the three internationals. Now, if you want to go a little bit further, as the Cold War went on after the fall of the Soviet Union, once the Cold War got going, there was a big split between China and the Soviet Union. So all over the world, there were a number of communist parties that were formed that were sympathetic to China and not the Soviet Union. They called themselves anti-revisionist parties. Sometimes they'd call themselves the Communist Party, and then they had parenthesis Marxist-Leninist afterwards. And the Maoist parties, or the anti-revisionist parties, those were parties that followed China rather than following the Soviet Union, and rather than being aligned with the communist parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union. All right, Mike Preisner. So these kind of things went on, right? And when the Soviet Union fell, there was a lot of confusion, right? And the global communist movement right now is in confusion because the Communist International stopped existing in 1942. China, basically in the 1980s, announced they did not want to align with communist parties around the world. They consider that it is not their business. They are not spreading communist revolution around the world. They are engaging in peaceful trade and cooperation. They're not trying to spread communist revolution. They don't want sister-aligned parties. There's a lot of Trotskyites that are still around. Various Trotskyite parties are around. And there's a lot of confusion. A lot of confusion now. And I argue, and my position in all of this, and this is why I'm telling you all this history, is I argue that we do not need another communist international. That we do not need to fit ourselves into the intricate debates. Are you a Trotskyist? Are you a Maoist? Are you a Marxist? That rather, we need to study all of these currents of leftism and blindly follow none of them. And that we need an eclectic, non-revisionist, revolutionary, we need an eclectic socialism that is unique and will address our current circumstances. And that we need to get out of the mindset that revolutionary parties have to have a family tree, and you have to be able to trace your organization back to Karl Marx. Rather, we need socialist principles, socialist concepts to be widely studied, and we need to develop a program to implement socialism. A program to implement socialism, an economic program, demands, policies, and develop an anti-imperialist socialist program and build a movement around that program. That it's a mistake, that we need to stop viewing communism like a religion, right? You know, every Methodist can tell you where the Methodist came from, and the Methodist church split from this church, it split from that church, it split from the Catholic church, which, you know, and that we need to stop viewing it this way, right? But rather, we need to view socialism as a tool. Socialism is a method for raising countries up out of poverty. It is a method for getting to the final goal of communism. But there are different ways of implementing it. There are different ways of implementing socialism. And we should study all of the attempts to build socialism around the world. Okay, what's this? Free concert of U.S. military band. And that is how we need to move forward. I jokingly tell people we need to become non-denominational communists. We need to study all of it, but blindly follow none of it. And that we need to develop a program, policies that we are for, rather than being able to trace a family tree of who we descended from, who we split from, who, you know, that is my position. And that's why I'm building a think tank and not a party. If I were to build a party, that party would immediately be declared to be, well, this party, see, Caleb used to be in this party, and this party split from that party, and people would start doing my family tree, and I don't want to organize that way anymore. I don't want to be part of this family tree, because this family tree isn't going to work, right? What's going to work is a socialist program. What's going to work is genuine anti-imperialism. What's going to work is being a factory of ideas that will stimulate conversation. That is what is needed. And we need to know all this history. We need to study the history of the three internationals. We need to study the history of anarchism, the history of Trotskyism, the history of Maoism, the history of social democracy, the history of anarchism and Bolivarianism and Ba'athist Arab socialism. We need to study all of this and develop a program. That is my argument. We need to be non-denominational, and we need to get beyond. I love what you said, Kristen. Well, thank you, Kristen. I appreciate that. We need to get beyond the religious and dogmatic aspects of our movement so that we can construct a genuine program using the science, not the dogma, but the science that has been laid out by those who came before us, and viewing socialism as a tool, rather than as a doctrine or a dogma. That is my position. So that's what I wanted to share with you in my opening remarks. I've got plenty of super chats here to answer, but keep them rolling in, as always. And I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Let's do our roll call. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Names and locations. Scotland. California, Dylan. Amazing opening. Ramsey, Controversy Machine, Chaya in Montreal, Cleveland Pirate Alex, Stephen in Riverside, Emma from Ontario, Canada, Tulare, California, Teddy in Southern California, Johnny in Philly, Kieran from San Diego, Lila in Dallas, Springfield, Missouri, Ross in Dublin, Northern California, New Jersey, Zephyr from Eugene, Oregon, Pomona, California, Gamer, Holly, Wisconsin, Northern California, Tucson, Arizona, Pennsyltucky, said Troy, okay. Kinky is here, Zach in Seattle, Steven in Seattle, Minden out of Midwest, Olympia Logic, good friend of the program, Nate in Chicago, great stream, South Korea, Clydebank, Mexico City, Ramsey in Cincinnati, Ohio, Enoch in Australia, Don in New York City, Los Angeles, Deborah Wilson in Napa. Shout out to you, Deborah, good friend of the program. Egan in Minnesota, Cincinnati, Jenny Lynn, good friend, Northern Cali, Quinn and Meredith in Eatonville, shout out to you all. Hello, Mark from California, shout out to you, Mark. Mo in Toronto, says North Star. Tristan in Maryland, good friend, Tristan. Happy Valley, Oregon, Argentina City Builder, Queens, New York, Flushing, Northern Ireland, Kristen Nye, Tennessee, Corona, California, Manhattan, Sam in Australia, Tokyo, Japan, Kendall from San Diego, Alberta, Old Gringo in Kansas City, Joshua Tree, California, Kinky, Vinicius from Brazil, Ben from the Workers' Party of Edinburgh, La Swan, Switzerland, John Whitty in Houston, Captain Waffles, all right, Mohsen from Iran, Ali from Northern Ireland, Rees from Adelaide, Australia, Micah from Las Vegas, Alan in Chicago, Hurricane, Carolyn Dario with Tamara in his heart from Brooklyn, Ragin' Cajun from Woodlands, Texas, Frank from Rhode Island, JT24 Mississippi, Captain Waffles from Treasure Coast, Florida, Chinese Bigfoot from Cambridge, New Zealand, Illinois, Tucson, Illinois, Arizona, Leipzig, East Germany. You're awesome. Caleb in California loves you. Thank you, Mr. Red. Gamer for Life, Austin, Texas, Neil Frazier out in Hong Kong. Shout out to you, Neil. Welcome. Detroit, Nashville, Tennessee, Wandering Left, Meredith, very good. Old Gringo, shout out to you. Harold, Naples, Florida. Alberto and Javier in Miami, Florida. Fort Lauderdale. Daniel in Seattle. Shout out to all of you. Wow. Bendigo, Australia. David Fox is here. Welcome, welcome. Julian from Southeast United Kingdom. Welcome, Julian. Calgary, Canada. Right. Toucher Gotti from Connecticut. Shout out to you, Toucher. Florida. Southwest Michigan, Hong Kong. Wow. So glad to have all of you here. Steve from Southwest Michigan, Steve Richter. Very, very good to have you all here. Welcome, everybody. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Good stuff, folks. Always glad to have you here. So glad to have you here. A couple business announcements, but keep the super chats rolling in. If there's something you want me to talk about, by all means, send me a super chat so I can talk to you about it. Keep the super chats rolling in. A couple business announcements. First of all, if you're in New York City, we are having an event in Union Square on Saturday at 5 p.m. We're going to have a little speak out, kind of a public speak out, public outreach speak out in Union Square. Won't be a huge event, but we're going to gather at 5 p.m. in Union Square. It should be fun. It should be a little bit of outreach. You know, we're going to get the community, some folks coming into town, some folks that are already here, John Brown volunteers, etc. So if you want to be part of that, please come. 5 p.m. In Union Square. We will be there. It should be fun. We'll see how it goes, right? You know, that'll be good. So I want you all to join us if you're in the New York City area. 5 p.m. Union Square. Please be there. It'll be great to see you all in person. That'll be fun. I also wanted to mention that the Saxton lectures, you know, we have 4 more. There's 4 that have been posted. Those are presentations I gave in Saxton, Pennsylvania. If you can help us promote, we have a playlist now for the Saxton lectures. You know, help us promote those because that's basically a very, very in-depth history of Marxism. So please, by all means, help us promote the Saxton lectures. A lot of good things are happening. A lot of good things are in the works. So, you know, I appreciate all of you. We are a community here at this channel. We are pushing out our message of optimistic, constructive socialism and anti-imperialism. So thank you for all that you do. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I think next I will start answering your super chats. So if you have another thing you want me to talk about, by all means, shoot me a super chat. And I'll keep going answering super chats until we are done. So thank you, folks. You know, a lot of good things happening. I'll probably be live late tomorrow night. I'll probably be live late tomorrow night, I would think, and then we'll be 5 for 5. So fingers crossed, late tomorrow night, 10:30 or so tomorrow night, we'll do this again. We're going to be 5 for 5, right? I did 5 days, right? And I'm going to, we're at 4 for 5 right now. This is number 4. So there we go. All right. The first question is about Lukács. Lukács was an important, I believe he was from Yugoslavia. He was a very important Marxist philosopher and Marxist intellectual. And I must say, I have not studied Lukács as much as I would like to. And I plan on reading shortly his book on Nietzsche. After seeing ContraPoints and her nasty, horrendous video about envy, and it has this whole tirade about Nietzsche, I understand Lukács, who is he was from Hungary, that's right, he's from Hungary, a very important Marxist intellectual from Hungary. He wrote an entire book critiquing Nietzsche from a Marxist perspective, which is very good. It's called, The Assault on Reason, or something like that. I'm going to read that. So I'm going to make a point of studying Lukács's critique of Nietzsche. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I don't know enough about Lukács, but he was a Marxist intellectual of the Cold War era who wrote about philosophy quite a bit. And I will say, if you can get your hands on the foundations of Marxism-Leninism, if you can get your hands on that, there's a lot of, people say the Soviet Union didn't produce good stuff. That's not true. There's a lot of books that were printed in the Soviet Union that are of a very high quality. A lot of the textbooks that they published are very good. Very informative. If you read the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course. If you read the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, there's a lot of very good textbooks, ideological textbooks that were produced in the USSR. Now, I'm not saying we should necessarily agree with everything in those books for obvious reasons. There's some, obviously the Soviet Union fell, but you can really get a good foundational understanding of the concepts that we talk on here by reading those textbooks. And again, the polemical texts, are very good to read once you have the foundations, once you understand the context. That's why those textbooks are very important. All right. Is the British Labour Party a lost cause? I would say that it is. I'm hesitant to say that. I know there are many Marxists who really do believe that they can practice entryism into the British Labour Party. But if we have learned anything from Jeremy Corbyn and what has happened with Jeremy Corbyn, we have learned that the British Labour Party is irredeemable. Jeremy Corbyn, he was the Labour Party's guy. And the way that they have dealt with him, calling him an anti-Semite, expelling him from the Labour Party, purging the Labour Party of people like the International Marxist Tendency and Trotskyites who supported him, purging the Labour Party of anyone who's pro-Palestine. The British working class doesn't trust the Labour Party. The British working class sees the Labour Party as a group that has betrayed them. The British working class wanted to be free from the European Union, and the Labour Party did not agree with them. The British working class largely sees the Labour Party as a party of identity politics, as a party of imperialism and war, and a party of the synthetic left. And the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, is being purged and his supporters are being purged, and that, I really look with great admiration to what is being done by the Workers' Party of the United Kingdom, George Galloway and Jyoti Brar. Now, I obviously don't agree with them on every point. There are obviously things that I would not agree with them, but George Galloway, Jyoti Brar, and the Workers' Party, they seem to be doing very amazing work. They've built an anti-identity politics, pro-Brexit socialist party, the Workers' Party of the United Kingdom. And they seem to be getting things done, and they are anti-imperialist. They invited me to speak on a great webcast that they did about Yemen, in standing in solidarity with the people of Yemen. They are reaching out to workers of different religious backgrounds. There are many workers that are in the Workers' Party that are Muslim, that are Jewish, that are Christian. They are not jumping on board with this identity politics cancel culture that has dominated left-wing circles. And they're a broad tent party. They're not a Marxist-Leninist vanguard party. I mean, there's people that are in various parties that are members of it, but they are largely a broad tent, a coalition around certain principles that they believe in. They are anti-imperialist, and so I tend to look at the work that the Workers' Party is doing with admiration. And I mean, obviously, I've heard various critiques, but from what I've heard, it is largely positive. They seem to be moving in a good direction, and that they really are the cutting edge. What they are doing is very much an example of out of the movement to the masses, out of the movement to the masses. Because we need to get out of, like kind of what I was saying in my opening, we need to get out of this trap that the left has built for itself, where we're stuck in dogma and we're isolated and we're tracing our heritage back to the. I argue that we need to be more eclectic, that we need to just formulate a program, and that we need to get out of the trap of our past, and we need to move into the present day and develop policy solutions that working people can fight for, and that's what I argue we need to do. It's crazy how we have to process everything, but I don't agree with everything this person says. Yes, cancel culture. Yeah, I'll write that down. Culture. Preface, yeah, I mean, I tend to think that they are kind of the cutting edge, and that that different political forces will emerge, right? And what Jimmy Dore is doing, what Jackson Hinkle is doing, what Haas and Infrared are doing, what Convo Couch is doing, what Millennial Splaining is doing, what the Medicare for All March is doing. This is the future of leftism. Medicare for all, they just said, look, we're for Medicare for all. That's it, right? Are you for Medicare for all? Are you against it? That's what we're for. That's the approach, right? And they raised a demand, Medicare for all. Are you for it? Are you against it? We're for it, and we're going to fight for it. And we're not going to be silly, and we're not going to cancel people. We're for it. Are you for it, or are you against it? And that scares the crap out of the ruling class. And all the phonies revealed themselves, right? The fact that they didn't embrace the Medicare for All March, the fact that they've now published articles trying to accuse the Medicare for All March of being Nazis, right? That's the latest. I think it was Real News published this big, long, scathing piece trying to link the Medicare for All March to white supremacists, and the fact that these people that are supposedly for Medicare for All attacked the Medicare for All March indicates that this is what really scares them, is a program, right? The Center for Political Innovation, we have a program. That's what we're for. I don't care. You can reject Marxism. You could say that you don't agree with a single thing Marx said. If you're for our program, you can join the Center for Political Innovation. The program. That is how revolutionary movements take power, is on the basis of their program. Frank Analysis, another great channel, on the basis of the program. The program. And Medicare for All is a great program. Now, we at the Center for Political Innovation, we have a 4-point program: mass mobilization to rebuild the country, public control of natural resources, public control of banking, and an economic bill of rights. That's our program, right? And with that program, and we talk about Fusion City and the need for Fusion City as an answer to climate change. We talk about the Sandino-Zapata economic corridor. These are things that people can be for or against, and it's a way to get out of the trap of getting all caught up in all the other stuff. So that's what I think. That's the way of the future, is putting forward the program and demanding the program. So there you go. All right. The Marx rewrote the manifesto after Paris. I don't know enough about that, Chaya. I just don't know enough about that. I mean, the Communist Manifesto was written in 1848, and it was written by the German Communist League, which was a group of Germans that were around Karl Marx that were part of the 1848 revolution. But I believe it was published after the 1848 revolution was over. It was published when they were in exile. I think they were in exile in London, and they made their document public to say, look, we fought in the German Revolution, we lost the German Revolution, but here's what we believe. And they published it. And I think if you read the preface to the Communist Manifesto, it's a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. They're making clear that this is public ownership of all land, right? Right. question mark. They're making clear that they are, this is what we're for, and this is what we believe, but our ideas are so widespread. There's people all over the world that are agreeing with our ideas, and so we just want to kind of get together and make clear what it is we believe, and they published the Communist Manifesto. All right, We Are City Builders. Nathaniel wanted to thank me for that book. Well, that book is meant as an organizing tool. That book is a textbook. And around the country, there are people that are discussing that book every week. In Texas, every week in Texas, the Texas local organizing of the Center for Political Innovation, every week they have a study session with that book. In Chicago, they have started having study sessions with that book. Every day here in New York, the John Brown Volunteers, we study that book or we study another Marxist text. That book is not just there for people to read. That book is very much intended as an organizing tool. With We Are City Builders, you can organize. You can organize a reading group for people to understand these concepts. It is a compilation of writings. Some of it was written by me, but a lot of it was written by Lenin. A lot of it was written by Mao. A lot of it was written by Albert Einstein, by Franklin Roosevelt, by Karl Marx. There's different sections from it. Edward Bellamy. It was designed as a textbook, as an educational manual, and that's why it exists. And if you want to start a reading group with the CPI manual, I can help you do that. I can ship copies to you at a low cost, at a bulk rate that is much cheaper than buying each copy individually on the website. So if you want to start a reading group around We Are City Builders, just let me know and I can make that happen, because that's really important. And that's how the CPI is kind of functioning. When we had our conference in Pennsylvania, every person, all 40 attendees, got their own copy. When we had our conference in Santa Barbara recently, all 35 attendees got their copy. And I know there's people in the infrared community that are having reading groups around it. And it is designed to be an educational manual for people to have discussions. It has, questions to discuss. It's designed to facilitate political education for the Center for Political Innovation. So I encourage people to keep doing that. That would be great, because we need to educate. Look, there are many important things. All right, third camp trots. There are many important things that you can be doing right now, right? Organizing labor unions. The fact there are workers, I believe Oreo workers are on strike right now. That's very important. Fighting for the unemployed and fighting against evictions from their homes. That's very important, right? Fighting racism and police brutality. Very important. Fighting for the rights of the immigrant community. Very important. Opposing these wars and engaging in anti-war activism. Very important. And I don't denigrate any of that. And I am not telling people that they shouldn't be doing any of that. I say the opposite. Fighting for Julian Assange, right? This is what people should be doing. People absolutely should be organizing around all these issues. But what I have chosen for myself as the task that I will engage in is the task of political education, the task of offering ideological and political education and engaging in political innovation to help us develop policy solutions. The Center for Political Innovation is an educational think tank dedicated to fostering a vision beyond capitalism. And that is the role that I have chosen to play in all of this. And that is the role that I would want to work with people in doing. If you want to help me facilitate that, that's great. Please work with me and do that. I don't care if you're a member of another group. I don't care if you do other kinds of activism. That's fine, but this is what I do. And I view myself in this way. And that I want to make this point, that a real revolutionary party does all of that and more. A real party, if there was a group that was really the vanguard of the American working class, it would have labor union leaders in it. It would have a newspaper and media. It would have anti-war activists in it. It would have educational think tanks and institutions associated with it. It would be doing all of what we're doing, fighting for women's rights, fighting for the rights of the black community, and fighting opposing police brutality. It would be doing all of what every leftist in the United States is doing and more, right? And it would function like an orchestra, right? In the orchestra, the whole orchestra can't play the oboe. If that's the case, you don't have an orchestra. You just have a bunch of oboes. The whole orchestra can't play the tuba. If that's the case, then you don't have an orchestra. You just have a bunch of tubas, right? In an orchestra, you have drums, you have pianos, you have tubas, you have oboes, you have violins, right? But they're together, they're coordinating their actions. The conductor is leading them, and as the orchestra, they can all play beautiful music. What we have in the United States right now on the left is we have a situation where we have violins, and the violins, instead of being part of the orchestra, they go around saying, if you are a real revolutionary, you should be a violin. Oh, you're an oboe? Oh, excuse me, I'm a real revolutionary, I'm a violin. And then we have, trumpeters, and they're walking around saying, well, if you're a real revolutionary, you're a trumpeter. And then we have tubas walking around saying, if you're a real revolutionary, you're a tuba. And as a result of that, all these groups can do about one thing well. And so what they do is they declare that thing that they do well is all that any group should do. And that is the problem. That is the problem, because at the end of the day, what CPI is doing is one task: political education, conferences, publishing books, study groups, educational events. We are an educational think tank. And if a real communist party existed in the United States, we would exist as the educational wing of that communist party. And it would also have a labor wing, and it would also have an anti-war activist wing, and it would also have a newspaper, and that's what we would do. But instead we have a fractured left where everyone declares what everyone else is doing to be a waste of time, and that only what they do is worth it. Well, I'm bigger than that, and I'm saying that no, I don't think anti-war protests are a waste of time. I don't think labor union organizing is a waste of time. I don't think that building united fronts and coalitions is a waste of time. But what I can do, the task that I can take on in the unique circumstances of my life, is building the Center for Political Innovation. And I've built this community. We have built this beautiful community here centered around this YouTube channel. We have specific concepts that we understand about the city building tendency out of the movement to the masses. And this is the task that I can perform. And if you want to perform this task with me, welcome aboard. And if you don't, good for you. I don't care, right? And tunnel vision, comrades. There is way too much competition, way too much mudslinging, way too much, I'm beyond that. This is the task that I can do, and I am focused on doing it. And if you want to do it with me, great. And if you don't want to do it with me, great. And if you want to do this and do something else, great, right? I talk to people. There's a lot of people who work with me that are in the Communist Party. There's a lot of people who work with me that are in the Party of Communists. There's a few people who work with me that are in the PSL. There's a few people that work with me that are in Trotskyist groups that shall not be named, because they'll probably get in big, huge trouble because I have all the criticism of Trotskyism I've made. There are people who work with me that are members of the DSA. There are people who work with me that are members of Maoist groups. There are many people who work with me that are not a member of any group. And I will, if they're willing to engage in this project, this political education project, building a think tank, that's fine. I don't care, right? This is the task that I can take on. This is what I am committed to doing, and I'm going to keep doing it. And I don't care, and I really have no interest in getting caught up in the drama, right? I really am not interested in getting caught up in the drama. Tunnel vision, comrades, tunnel vision. And the whole point is out of the movement to the masses. Or as Vladimir Lenin said, lower and deeper to the real masses. All right? There are millions of Americans who don't understand what we believe, have never met a socialist, never met a communist, have no clue why anyone would be such a thing, right? And it is our job to get lower and deeper to the real masses, to the broad masses of Americans who are angry, who are hungry, who have lost their jobs and lost their homes and are ready to fight back. And we need to give them an ideology and a perspective to fight back with, right? That it's not enough. Spontaneity, day-to-day economic struggles is not enough. That it is necessary to infuse the working class with a line of march, with a trajectory of politics. It is necessary to do that, and that is what we are trying to do, because practice without theory is dead, and that many of the people that are angry and mobilizing right now are becoming Trump supporters. Many of the people that are angry and mobilizing right now are becoming conspiracy theorists. Many of the people that are angry and mobilizing right now are ending up adopting identity politics and synthetic leftism. We need to rectify. We need to give them a clear line of march, an optimistic, constructive socialist message, and a program around which they can rally. And if that is not done, ultimately, their struggles, their spontaneous rebellion will only lead to making things worse, right? That really, without a clear line of march, without a trajectory, without political innovation, this is the only way forward. This is the task that needs to be done, and this is the task that I can do. With my life circumstances and my job, I cannot join any political party, and I wouldn't if I could. This is what I can do. This is what I will do. And if you want to do it with me, welcome. And if you don't want to do it, okay, that's fine. I can do it without you. I don't need you, right? This is what I can do. And the fact that it drives these folks crazy, the fact that there is so much hostility and anger directed at me by so many people shows how desperately this needs to be done. And if I was in one of these groups, I wouldn't be able to do this, but I'm not. And that's why I'm able to do this. So just keep that in mind. Next question, demonizing the unvaccinated. Well, look, I'm vaccinated. So is my wife. So are all my coworkers. I don't think the vaccine is a conspiracy or a hoax. I've got questions just like anybody. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a germologist or whatever. I'm not generally anti-vax. I'm not generally vaccine critical. I think the vaccine is a good thing. That said, rather than getting mad at people that are anti-vaxxers, why don't you get mad at the U.S. government that has lied to the American working people so many times, so many lies, so many deceptions, let the country fall to shambles, that the American people largely don't trust their government. They don't trust their elected officials, and they don't trust their government. And now we're at a time when people in a situation like this, with a very serious matter of public health, people need to be able to trust their government. In a situation like this, we need to be able to trust the government. And the fact that they've lied over and over and over again, and now people don't trust them, that shows that's a failure on their part. I'm sorry, if you lie to somebody, if someone comes to you and they lie to you over and over and over again, they tell you 16 lies, and then they tell you something true and you don't believe them, whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? I'm sorry, whose fault is that? I'm sorry, the fact that there are millions of Americans who don't believe in the vaccine is not the fault of them just, oh, look, they're so stupid. No, they just have been lied to so many times, right? The little boy who cried wolf, right? I blame the government for this. Our government is in complete dereliction of duty. It has lied and taken us into wars. It has let the country fall into shambles. It's let our roads fall apart. It's let our water not be properly purified. It has let opioid addiction, destroy so many lives. It has let a whole generation of young people face a future of short-term service sector jobs. It has created a prison industrial complex and prisons for profit. I charge the government of the United States with criminal neglect. It has abandoned the people that it is chartered to serve. The people of the United States, the working people of this country, have been spit on, they've been abandoned, their government has left them behind. I charge the government of the United States with criminal neglect, with dereliction of duty. And that is who I blame for the fact that there is so much confusion about the vaccines. And I'm not going to blame average working people who don't know what to believe anymore I'm sorry, I'm not going to fall into that trap. And I'm annoyed by the smugness of liberals who fall into that trap. I'm not anti-vax. I'm vaccinated. I can show you my vaccination card if you want. I am definitely vaccinated. But at the same time, I don't fall into the trap of hating my fellow workers who are critical of the status quo. Because where does this lead? This leads to Jabba the Vosh sitting there and saying, if you don't believe that the Chinese government, everything they say, then you're the same as a Nazi, right? This is leading to an authoritarian place where questioning anything the U.S. government said is considered a danger to public health, and you get silenced. And I'm not going to stand for that, right? The pro-war cancel culture that's happening, no, not going to stand for it. The demand that people blindly believe what the government says or else they get canceled, not going to stand for it. I don't like where this is going. I don't like the notion that everyone who doesn't support the USA bombing Syria and doesn't accept the allegations about chemical attacks in Syria is the same as a Holocaust denier and deserves to be beaten up and killed by Antifa. I don't accept that. That's what Vosh believes. That's what the leadership of DSA believe, right? That's what Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris, that's what they believe. Not going to happen. All right. Failure in Afghanistan. Look, the United States created instability in Afghanistan for years, and now they've withdrawn, and they've made it Russia, China, and Iran's problem. And there was long-standing negotiation with the Taliban in the lead up to it. The USA wrecked and destroyed Afghanistan. And now, after 20 years of wrecking and destroying Afghanistan, allowing drug gangs to flourish, allowing terrorist groups to flourish, sowing instability, now they left and they said, all right, it's somebody else's problem now. And I don't view this isn't Vietnam. This isn't, the National Liberation Front destroying the imperial. That's not what this is. This is the USA shifting tactics. All right. Mike Preisner, he's a member of the Party of Socialism and Liberation who fought in Iraq. And I guess the question was about the fact that he is building some kind of organization of soldiers or something. Well, I respect his right to do that. During the Vietnam War, that was very, very important. It was very important to build such organizations. The VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, that was built by the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, the American Servicemen's Union, that was built by the Workers' World Party. These are important things. And the fact that there are many, many people in the U.S. military right now who are against these wars and realize that they are not being sent to defend democracy or protect Americans from terrorism. They're rather being sent to fight for the profits of big corporations. That's a good thing. And I don't think it's the correct attitude to cancel them and say, oh, they're bad people. Again, we'll get to the cancel culture thing later. But as much as I'm certainly not endorsing the political party that Mr. Preisner is a member of, and I think organizing against the wars among soldiers is a generally good thing. It's a good thing to do, right? And having outreach directed at soldiers, I think that's a good thing, right? Many working class people are in the military, and that's one thing that a lot of working class people don't understand, right? All right, I'm sorry, that's one thing that a lot of these middle class leftists rather don't understand. Barbara Einreich and class, all right. Barbara Einreich class. That's one thing that these folks don't understand, right? In working class communities, you tend to have people that have relatives that have been in the military or are in the military. You tend to have people who have relatives who've been in prison, or they themselves have been in prison. And that working class life is a lot more authoritarian, right? There's a lot more authoritarianism in working class life. And a lot of these bread tubers are middle-class kids who are put off by any notion of authoritarianism. Their leftism is an expression of this kind of juvenile rebellion against authority. And that's why they're so anti-tanky and they're confused. But working-class people tend to already have a very big amount of authoritarianism in their lives, you know, and you know that the ability to, you know, to have no one tell you what to do, and to, you know, to not face harsh punishments in life, to not, you know, that is a very much of a class privilege. You know, the way, you know, the suburban schools operate versus the way that schools operate in rural areas or in urban areas is very different. You know, in these urban schools here in New York City, the police are everywhere. You know, there's police officers and kids get arrested for getting into fistfights. You know, I mean, that's not something that kids in suburban schools have to deal with. They get into fistfights, but they might not get arrested, right? They might just be disciplined for it. You know, and again, there is a lot of, you know, working people face a lot of authoritarianism in their lives, and this belief that we should cancel anyone who's military because that's fascist. Joining the military is fascist. No, it's something that a lot of working class people do. Right? It's a job that many working class people have. Right? The idea that we should cancel, you know, I mean, look, I'm not for what the U.S. military does. I'm not advocating that people join the U.S. military by any means, right? You know, I don't think that's a good, you know, the military, they get treated very, very awful, and what they do is you know, carry out the wars for empire. But this stigmatization of anyone who's ever been in the military is very wrong, and it's very middle class, and it's very juvenile, and it's very childish. Right? You know, and it cuts us off from the working class. A lot of people I went to school with went into the military. And nowadays, people that are in the military tend to be more anti-war than the population at large because they're faced with it. They can't avoid the question. There's a lot of people who are like, well, I don't know about these wars, but if you're in the military, that war is your life. And, you know, Ron Paul, the libertarian, was very popular among soldiers because of that. And right now, people in the military tend to be anti-interventionist. You know, so no, we got to get beyond, this canceling of people for being in the military. That's not correct. We can oppose recruitment. We can recommend people make other life choices than going into the military. You know, and we can oppose the wars that the military wages. But no, this canceling people. No, we need more people in the military to be understanding Marxism and socialism and anti-imperialism. We need more Mike Preisners out there. So no, I don't accept at all this idea that he's a bad person because he once served in the military and became an anti-war activist, or that trying to bring Marxism to soldiers is somehow a bad thing. And that is the height of middle class deviation, right? We should want as many soldiers as possible to be interested in socialism and to oppose these wars. I mean, give me a break. All right. A free concert for a U.S. military band. Well, I mean, look, you know, there's a lot of good music that military bands play, you know, but the main thing is to engage with people and, you know, to talk with people, and talk to them about what these wars are for and who they really serve, and, you know, to have a conversation, to have a respectful conversation with people. And, you know, and engage with people in a way where they can listen, right? Where you can, talk about Afghanistan, talk about Syria, talk about Libya, talk about the results of these regime change wars, what they mean. You know, I think that would be a great place to have a conversation with people, but it would have to be done tactfully. You'd have to do it in a careful way where it didn't get heated and emotional, where people would listen. So I think that would be a great opportunity to engage with people. So there you go. Isn't it sad we have to cancel everything with a preface, or we have to preface everything with a you know, I don't agree with everything this person said. Yeah, it is, and I probably shouldn't even do that, right? You know, I probably shouldn't even... have to say that. I probably shouldn't do that because that's like disassociating, and I shouldn't have to do that, right? Because look, in order to get anything done, you're going to have to agree with people who don't agree. You're going to have to agree to disagree with people on some things. You're going to have to cooperate with people who might not agree with you on some points. That's just how this is going to work. All right, at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to only work with people who agree with you on a certain point, right? And there are some points where I can see both sides. You know what I'm saying? And there are some points where I'm critical of both sides, and I feel like the way both sides express themselves is critical. And I've noticed that when you say that, when you come forward and you say, well, look, there's ways that this side is arguing that I don't think are correct. And there's also ways this side is arguing that's not correct. The answer is somewhere in the middle. Both sides lose their shit at you, right? People want a very, very, very clear answer. The abortion debate is a great example. I am for the legalization of abortion. Abortion should be legal. It should be accessible. There should not be restrictions on it. And I think that any doctor should be able to do an abortion. I don't think they should have abortion clinics and abortion licenses. If a woman and her doctor feel that the woman should get an abortion, she should get an abortion, period. That's my position on abortion, right? That said, I understand why many people throughout the United States don't agree. First of all, I know that there are many African Americans and Puerto Ricans and indigenous people that are against abortion because they know that the white man has been trying to wipe them out for years, right? Puerto Rican women who had their tubes tied against their wishes. There were Malthusian attempts to exterminate black people, and that many people that are historically colonized, historically oppressed, feel like abortion, and they associate abortion and birth control with efforts by the colonizer and the oppressor to wipe them out. And they don't like it for that reason. And they see family as very important. They see having kids as an obligation to procreate in order to keep building the world. And I understand. I don't completely understand because I'm not from one of those groups. But I comprehend that they might be suspicious of abortion and they might not be comfortable with abortion on that basis, right? I know there are some people that are very religious that feel that abortion is just immoral based on their beliefs. And again, I don't agree with them, but I comprehend why they might feel that way. I feel that again, there needs to be an understanding that this is an issue that Americans are just never going to see eye to eye on. I'm never going to be able to convince an anti-choice, an anti-abortion person to be pro-choice. Never have I ever seen anyone change their opinion on it. No one ever goes, oh, a fetus is a life. No one ever goes, oh, it is the woman's right. No one does that around the abortion issue. It's just an issue that culturally, politically, for whatever reason, some people are going to take one position and some people are going to take another. And it's a culture war, and rather than have that, I would be happy to work with people who are anti-abortion around the issue of socialism, and I wouldn't agree with them, and I personally would tell them, if they asked me directly, I would say, well, I might understand some of where you're coming from. I personally think abortion should be legal, but I wouldn't cancel them for it, and I would just say, you know what, there you go. That's my position, and that's that. And I wish that people would realize that Antifa and the ultra rich. I wish people would realize that rather than having a fight over something like the abortion issue, that there's never going to be agreement on, no, there's never going to be a change on it. Why don't we mobilize around real economic demands that people of different perspectives could agree on, right? And that seems to be what both the synthetic left and the right are terrified of. The right is mobilizing their membership and telling them that everything they don't like as right-wingers is communism. The left, the synthetic left, is telling everyone that if you talk about class struggle and economics, you're a class reductionist, you're a red-brown Nazbol tanky. And both the synthetic left and the right wing are both trying their hardest to keep the rabble, we the people, us, the working class, the majority of the country, from realizing our own interests. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to mobilize culture wars. They're trying to push and they're terrified of the day that we get up and we say, you know what? We want a government of action that fights for working families. We want a government that fulfills its responsibility and provides jobs, healthcare, and education. They're terrified that we're going to do that someday. And both the left and the right are mobilizing against the inevitable conclusion of a capitalist economic crisis, which is working class resistance. All right. Public ownership of all land. I'm not for public ownership of all land. In fact, I think that home ownership, private home ownership, is something that we should want to expand. I want more working people to own their own homes, to have their own personal home ownership. Now, as far as agribusiness and farmland, I can understand that that would be a transition towards socialism, would be the nationalization of farmland, obviously the nationalization of natural resources. But I think there should be private home ownership, and that housing in terms of landlords, that's one area where working people are exploited. I mean, landlords, I mean, just to breathe, to live, to have a roof over your head, you have to pay some capitalist, right? And I think that socialist countries have done a lot to increase private home ownership. I think individual families, should have their own homes that they own, that are they're not renting from a bank, they're not renting from a big landlord, but rather they own it. I don't think public ownership of land is a good demand, because I want to maximize private home ownership. All right. Third camp, Trotskyists and the Democratic Socialists of America. Well, Leon Trotsky, he broke with the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union rejected his theory of permanent revolution, but instead adopted policies of socialism in one country, Leon Trotsky and his followers, they broke with the Soviet Union and they formed the Fourth International. But then the Fourth International maintained that the Soviet Union was a degenerated workers' state. It was socialist in its economic foundations, but they argued that it had a parasitical bureaucracy that was not revolutionary, that didn't have genuine socialist politics. So they called to maintain the economic foundations of the Soviet Union while calling for a, quote, political revolution against the bureaucracy. That was the Trotskyite position. In 1939, the Soviet Union signed a pact with Nazi Germany that was absolutely necessary because the world capitalist countries wouldn't align with the Soviets. The French briefly did and then cut them off. The Soviet Union stood alone in helping the people of Spain and fighting against Franco. And so out of desperation, the Soviet Union signed the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And what was interesting is Trotsky had long advocated that the Soviet Union sign such a pact. However, at the time that they signed it, Trotsky said they signed it in an unprincipled way. They signed it in a way that was disoriented. He criticized the manner in which they signed it, but Trotsky was okay with signing such a pact. He just didn't agree with how they signed it. But when they signed the pact, the Trotskyites of the world went into an anti-Soviet frenzy. There was actually a song that was published to the tune of My Darling Clementine. Up in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the year of 39, there's a Russian and a Prussian riding up the party line. Leon Trotsky was a Nazi, oh, we knew that for a fact. When Pravda said it, we all read it, until the Stalin-Hitler pact. Now old Trotsky, once a Nazi, that was then the party line. But now the Nazis are hotsy-totsy, and Trotsky's setting British minds. It was making fun of the Communist International for, zigging and zagging, which they had to do. The Trotskyites, went into this anti-Soviet frenzy, right? And it was directed from the U.S. ruling class. Time magazine started calling the Communist Party of the United States, they called them the Communazis. And there was this because the Soviet Union signed a pact with the Nazis, they went into this frenzy. Well, some of the Trotskyites in 1939, Max Shachtman, Martin Aburn, and James Burnham, three Trotskyites that were in New York City, they were leaders of the New York City Trotskyites, they broke with Trotsky. And they announced that the Soviet Union was not a degenerated workers' state anymore. They said it was state capitalism or bureaucratic collectivism. They said it was not a workers' state anymore, and Trotsky vehemently disagreed with them. And so the followers of Shachtman and Aburn and Burnham, they left the Socialist Workers' Party, and they were what you called third camp Trotskyites, meaning that Trotsky said there are two camps in the world. There's the Soviet Union and the working class, and there's the capitalist class in the West. They said, well, no, there's the Soviet Union, which is state capitalism, and then there's the West, but then there's this third camp. We're for this third camp of Trotskyism or whatever. Well, Trotsky disagreed with them. But after World War II, a number of the third camp Trotskyites began working for the CIA. Irving Kristol, who was a third camp Trotskyite, he started something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA institution that funneled money to leftist voices that were pro-imperialist. One of the people who was funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom was Irving Howe, and Irving Howe became the founder of DSA. Michael Harrington, who had worked with Max Shachtman, was also a founder of the DSA. So the roots of Democratic Socialists of America go back to the third camp Trotskyites who broke with Leon Trotsky over the question of the Soviet Union. So that's probably what the person asking the question was referring to. However, DSA is much broader now. There's a lot of people in DSA that are just liberals at this point, that aren't, they're not part of any, they're not Trotskyites or anything, they're just liberals. But that's the roots of DSA. All right, Barbara Einreich. Speaking of DSA, there's an intellectual named Barbara Einreich. She wrote a book called Nickeled and Dimed, which was a very popular book about, what it's like to be a low-wage worker in the service sector and the difficulties of doing that. A very popular book. She's an important intellectual. She writes about Marxism and such. She's more of a social democrat, I would argue. But she does bring some Marxian analysis. So she's my friend on Facebook, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And, she does good work, and her work has been very inspiring to many people. It comes from a Marxist perspective, for sure, but it's, she's an academic who has written about class struggle and opposed neoliberalism, much like Naomi Klein. I don't have a beef with her. There you go. Antifa. Someone said, what about Antifa and the ultra-rich? Well, I would argue that right now there's a division in the ruling class between the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, the lower-level capitalists that favor a more libertarian outlook, and the Eastern establishment, the ultra-rich, that favor a more globalist outlook and a more state-controlled, slow-growth, social managerial perspective. If you watch my video, Who is Behind Joe Biden, if you watch other presentations I've given, this has long been my analysis. I have argued that there is a split in the ruling class, and that the anti-fascism we're seeing from the ultra-rich is their attempt to suppress a rebellion among the lower-level capitalists. And so that puts Antifa as kind of the foot soldiers of this higher faction of the ruling class against the lower levels, and that makes, QAnon kind of the foot soldiers of the lower-level capitalists. So there you go. I don't know who Paul J. is, so I can't comment on that, Piha. I just cannot. I just don't know who that is. But on that note, folks, I'm going to end it here. It's been a lovely day. Thank you for your support. Thank you for all that you do. We're a great community. Please join us on Saturday if you're in the area. Start a We Are City Builders reading group in your area. We're moving ahead. We're marching ahead. We have a lot to do. But we are the city building tendency, and we're moving ahead. So a new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.